Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches. And today I'm going to be talking about the 1929 German silent film Pandora's Box. And in the film we meet Lulu. Lulu is the mistress of a respective middle-aged newspaper publisher, Dr. Schoen. And she dreams of marrying him and having respectability. But, like a lot of powerful men, Schoen intends to marry for political gain, not for passion. Lulu may be young and beautiful and vivacious, but she won't help him win friends in the corridors of government, and so he has instead set his sights on the daughter of a government minister. Lulu, however, is not a woman who gives up without a fight. Unfortunately, her efforts to win respectability, and not to mention financial security, are going to be repeatedly undermined both by her loyalty to her disreputable friends and by her tendency to trust the word of the men she meets who universally prove to be, unreliable, untrustworthy people. Can Lulu find a happy outcome after all of the trials that life has to throw at her? Well, as it happens, that will very much depend on which version of the film you see. But more about that later. So Pandora's Box is based on a pair of plays by German playwright Frank Wedekind, and it was initially a critical failure in its home country. It was dismissed by the domestic critics for its lack of fidelity to the source material, and in particular to the decision to cast horrors, an American actor in the lead role. Several decades later, however, the film would be rediscovered by film scholars, and it would earn a reputation as a classic of its era. In fact, I first encountered Pandora's Box in a university film class. Now, I didn't like every movie that I saw for that class, but I did appreciate this one. So let's talk about some of its interesting features. So first of all, the American actor that the German critics were so offended by was Louise Brooks, and Brooks was a jazz age icon who personified the flapper style. Originally a dancer, Brooks employed her looks and sensuality to win over both the boss of Paramount Studios and the cinema-going audience at large. And through the late 20s, she worked in Hollywood. But by 1929, she was tired of working within the Hollywood system because she felt that her intelligence and skill were not valued, and she was still treated like a child by the men she worked with. So she left for Weimar, Germany, which at the time had the only comparable film industry in the world to that of Hollywood. Now, as I've noted, and given the reception that this film got, the move was not entirely successful. German critics resented her for being a foreigner, and contemporary audiences of the time were used to an exaggerated theatrical style of silent film acting, whereas Brooks had a much more naturalistic approach, and they found it bewildering and strange. They were like, she doesn't do anything. She's just there on screen. Now, of course, in choosing this style, Brooks was far more prescient than the cinema-goers who criticised her. Brooks was aware that films such as Pandora's Box were using lots more tight close-ups of the actors, a trend that has obviously continued into modern filmmaking, and that the exaggerated acting style that had come before looked false and forced and feigned under those circumstances. Now, Brooks would return to Hollywood after only making a relatively few number of films in Europe, a move that also went poorly for her, as the studios informally blacklisted her after she refused to do sound retakes on a film that was originally produced as a silent movie. Her career never recovered, but in the mid-1950s, her work of this era was rediscovered by a French critic named Henri Langlois, and I have to say, in her work in Pandora's Box, we can genuinely see an actor who was ahead of her time. To a modern audience, her naturalistic style seems exactly that, natural, unaffected. It's much more compelling and convincing than is generally the case of acting in movies from this era. So, the second thing that's interesting about Pandora's Box is the content, which for the time was quite risque. Now, the 1920s were a time of embracing modernity and of breaking with tradition. They were a time of social revolution, and they marked a significant reduction in sexual inhibitions as the world emerged from the trauma of the war to end all wars. Nowhere was this more evident than in Weimar, Germany, which was renowned for its progressive politics, extravagant nightlife, burgeoning art scene, relaxed censorship laws, and vocal gay rights organisations. Now, bear in mind, this was still over 90 years ago. So what was cutting edge and risque at the time is not necessarily what would be cutting edge and risque at the time today. Pandora's Box contains no nudity, no blood, no graphic violence, no profanity. But by the standards of its times, it took full advantage of the Weimar Republic's freedom of expression. Our heroine, Lulu, does trade sex for money. First under the guise of being a mistress, which is sort of seen as a more, I guess, classy way of doing it, but later sort of more openly in a sort of direct transactional prostitution kind of way. Now, we're still supposed to hope for her success, and her choices are not depicted as making her lesser by doing it, which is what's unusual about it, and would probably still be somewhat unusual today, in fact. And we are encouraged to see her, despite her flaws, because she does have them, as a generally decent person, better, in fact, than the wealthy and powerful men she meets. Similarly, one of the few people who does genuinely help Lulu is a lesbian, whose willingness to help is like clearly inspired by sexual infatuation. And this kind of content led to the film undergoing significant censorship in other countries. The lesbian character became a childhood friend, and in many cases the film was drastically shortened from its original 133 minutes. This was most often done by basically cutting much of the more difficult times that Lulu had to endure and substituting a much earlier ending to the film. Now, I'm going to dive a little bit more into that ending now, and how it parallels and resonates with history. So if you don't want to be spoiled about kind of how this movie wraps up, it's probably time to stop the video. So I'll give you a few seconds of silence to do that. Okay, if you're still with me, one of the risky, as opposed to risque, things that the original German version of Pandora's Box does is that it delivers a downbeat ending. Lulu is a woman trying to prosper in a time that, even more than today, gives all of the advantages to men. No matter how hard she plays the game, the deck is irretrievably stacked against her. Every move she makes to control her own destiny leads pretty inexorably to adverse outcomes. And the French, US and UK versions of the film all jettisoned this element. Instead, they put in this pat, and then she found God and joined the Salvation Army kind of resolution to the movie. The original ending is a much more powerful one than that ending, and it's an ending that resonates both in terms of the course of Louise Brooks' own life and European history that followed this film. Like Lulu, Brooks used sensuality to her advantage, and like Lulu, she attempted to carve her own path against the whims of powerful men, and her career suffered because of it. She was punished at least in part for attempting to be the controller of her own destiny. Speaking more broadly, Lulu's decline from a vibrant, vivacious young woman to a desperate destitute whose life ends in violence can also be seen as an unintentionally prescient forecast of the future of Weimar Germany itself. Financial instability would see the Republic lurch into political turmoil, and it ended just 4 years after the release of this film with the rise to power of the Nazi Party and the decade plus of horrors that unleashed. So should you see this movie? Well, if you're a student of film or a student of history, the answer is unequivocally yes. It's a fascinating look into the development of the cinematic art and of social change and conflict. On the other hand, if you're just looking for a fun diversion for a couple of hours, this is probably not the movie to put on. It's not always an easy watch. So that's Pandora's Box. Next time, a much lighter film, though one with a much higher body count. The 2009 action movie nonsense that is The Tournament. But that's next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.